It was a sunny, warm day in the city. The giant hamster busied itself with important work, its paws rapidly digging into the earth. In no time, it had carved a canal through the entire street. Gabriel, curious, asked what Pong was doing. The reply was simple. The rodent was preparing to widen the road. In the process, humble laborers suddenly took on the skill of master craftsmen. Once, there had been a city called Rome, famed for its roads. Among them was the legendary Appian Way. Now, Royd intended to build something similar starting from the Baron's home and ending at the Eastern Hill. Gabriel expressed surprise at the need for such a project, but Royd assured him that, in time, the town would become a popular destination for visitors. The servant then inquired about the source of Royd's knowledge, how he had conceived a heating system no one had ever heard of, and how he could summon beings from beyond. To Gabriel, it seemed like magic of the highest order. Cautiously, he asked if Royd was truly their rightful master. At that moment, Royd sensed a dangerous shift. Gabriel was beginning to doubt him. The man began to sweat, and Gabriel listened intently, awaiting a reasonable explanation for this sudden change. Kim Suo, even when reading about this guard in the novel, knew the man's capabilities. He could easily deduce if a stranger had taken the body of the Baron's son and would eliminate him without hesitation. Still, Royd had no reason to fear. He possessed a special skill designed for such situations, one he had honed in secret from everyone. His special skill was perseverance. Gabriel believed that his young master once indulged in days of secret drinking, but Roy denied this, saying the servant was not with him every hour of the day. Perhaps he truly had been a reckless fool and a party-goer before, but Gabriel knew nothing of what had occupied him in recent times. Yet how could the master explain his sudden magical prowess? Even experienced mages sometimes fail at such feats. In his defense, Roy decided to ask the servant directly how he could manipulate mana so effortlessly despite being barely in his 20s. Perhaps someone had taught him. Gabriel did not consider himself a brilliant magician, yet Roy tried to persuade him otherwise. This exchange gave the servant pause for serious thought. Using his quick wit and persistence, the young master swiftly ended the conversation and went about his business alone. Roy began to grow uneasy over the abrupt discussion with the servant. Soon after, the man approached the Bion Knight, requesting him to monitor the work's progress in his absence. The knight agreed, assuring him that everything would be handled. Gabriel insisted on accompanying him, stating it was his duty to protect his master. Roy offered no objection, and together they set off. Their destination was a place along the trail of an unpaid debt, leading them to a small town within the Redhead estate. On the way, they passed a wooden sign that read Hotel. Inside, a man suddenly slammed his fist on a table and began swearing this was the house of the intruder, RHS. He cursed loudly, unable to believe he had lost all his money, vowing that those responsible would pay. Another man, cloaked in black, approached and remarked that such was the risk of gambling after all. That was how the man earned his fortune. Realizing the gambler could not pay for his services, he announced that he would be leaving immediately. The gambler, however, insisted he could pay and even offered more if the man stayed. The problem was that RHS could only make money by deceiving others, but now too many sought revenge on him, forcing him into hiding. Hearing these words, Roy assumed they were speaking about him and kicked the door open. RHS and his partner were stunned understandably, as they had never met in person before. Roy introduced himself, ensuring there was no doubt about his identity. The shock and fear on their faces were unmistakable. In an instant, the cloaked man ordered his men to flee. The large man in the black robe scooped up his boss and leapt with him straight through the window. They landed in the city center, the big man still carrying RHS. Frowning in concentration, he was confronted by Gabriel, sword drawn. Gabriel swung the blade with precision, aiming to intimidate. He ordered the cloaked man to hand over RHS, assuring him no harm would come if he complied. Events unfolded exactly as Roy had predicted. They had attempted escape through the window. Roy instructed Gabriel to remain there. The man in the black robe, visibly angered, asked if Gabriel even knew how to wield a sword. His eyes turned white, and a swirling mass of black and red magic formed in his hands. Since the Baron's death, Xavier sought only revenge. He now faced a duel against RHS's personal bodyguard, a criminal whose trail he had pursued. This was also his first battle with a dark wizard, and resisting the pull of gravity magic was no easy feat. The cloaked man hurled magic bullets at Gabriel, one after another. But with supreme skill, Gabriel deflected each attack, the dark magic shattering into fragments that scattered into the air. Standing his ground with unwavering confidence, Gabriel locked eyes with the wizard. According to the plan, the enemy was to be eliminated. Gabriel's fist struck toward his opponent's face, but at that moment, the servant managed to rise to his feet. In the novel, Xavier fought the bastard while still only a mere weapon specialist. When the magician looked at him, he was visibly surprised he saw Xavier's heart of mana and turned pale. After all, the real Xavier possessed a heart of mana with a triple ring encircling it. With renewed strength, Gabriel took a swing with his sword. Then he noticed something. Did the man have magic that could control gravity? Mother had no choice but to aim her fist in Gabriel's direction, but in an instant, he was in the air. Even though they hadn't agreed to that, RHS only had time to reach out to his assistant to stop him, but Gabriel was faster. Gabriel turned to RHS and asked if he knew what happened to people who cheated honest men. The criminal was terrified and unable to respond. The servant drove him into a dead end. Unable to escape, the man stumbled and fell into a pile of barrels. Gabriel intended to leave him without legs so that he would be forced to crawl to court on all fours. RHS tried to cover his face with his hand. Gabriel raised his sword to strike, but at that moment, RHS ordered him to stop. Blocking the criminal with his own body, RHS faced the servant. The young frontier man justified his action, saying that Gabriel was not going to act wisely after all. If the man went to court legless, he would be punished too severely. At that moment, Gabriel realized he had almost committed the same kind of crime as this bastard. Would his master now also show compassion for others? The city lay silent under the night sky, the moon peeking out from behind drifting clouds. In a small room, a frightened RHS sat tied to a chair by ropes near a table, uncertain of what was to come. Across from him, Royd sat with a calm expression, hands folded in front of him. Royd decided to offer a bit of encouragement so the criminal would not be so afraid. After all, when lives are on the line, people tend to be greedy. They will do anything if they think there's a chance. The criminal didn't understand what this man was getting at. Royd shared his thought that taking the man's head would be too cruel. This gave RHS a flicker of hope that forgiveness might be possible. The young frontline soldier wanted to ensure the money was returned. RHS agreed, but only on the condition that he first receive forgiveness. The owner graciously agreed, saying that forgiveness was the essence of their existence. RHS still could not fully grasp the man's true intentions, but suddenly, Royd added one more condition. The criminal, desperate for release, was willing to do anything for forgiveness. All he had to do was sign the contract brought by the swarm. The man explained it was a standard labor contract, one that even came with a salary. However, there was a catch. 80% of his pay would be deducted to repay his debt to the owner. RHS was far from amused by this clause. At such a rate, it would take 520 years to pay off the swarm. It was not an appealing prospect, as the debt was enormous. As Gabriel had expected, his master had not come to offer sympathy or pardon. But the young front man was not foolish enough to kill someone who owed him money. Such a rash act would serve no purpose. Instead, he intended to drain every last coin from him for the rest of his miserable life. The disheartened Royd asked why, for the sake of all that was good in the world, they would offer him such a slave-like contract. His words surprised the young Frona. They had no choice but to force him to sign it. And so, in tears and despair, the criminal signed the slave contract. The next morning, sunlight spilled gently over the land. A chariot carrying 3 men traveled along a forest road. Gabriel told his master he had managed to extract some money from Roy enough to cover interest payments for several months. However, the owner replied that the money would be used solely for construction. In Roy's opinion, 30 workers were no longer enough. Frona wondered why none of the townspeople had responded to his job posting. Perhaps his reputation had simply preceded him. A few days later, the men returned to their hometown and approached Fronterer's estate. A sign announced they were in need of laborers, offering 20 gold pieces each. Before long, a line of eager men formed in front of Roy's table. Roy was surprised to see so many people. He had assumed they hated him, and Gabriel was certain they did. Yet, his master had promised to install the heating system on time and at a low price. He had also punished the traitor of the estate by having him brought before a higher court. Roy claimed he wanted to prove himself reliable and worthy of trust. He could hardly believe it was that simple until his thoughts were interrupted by the next man in line, who was interested in the job. Roy explained the details and how to sign the agreement, but before doing so, the man expressed his gratitude to the Baron's son. Roy was taken aback. The man explained that his child often fell ill whenever the weather turned cold, but thanks to the young master's heating system, this year he had no such worries. He bowed deeply, sincerely thanking Roy. The young heir was touched by the man's words, though slightly embarrassed. After all, his true motivation had been profit. The man added that he had relatives in the nearby Raiken estate who also wished to have the underfloor heating system installed. To him, this was the first step toward prosperity and expansion. Roy realized his efforts had not been in vain. He immediately began considering a price increase, citing additional travel costs. His expression revealed he was ready to accept payment on the spot. Gabriel found this troubling, but Roy insisted he needed the funds to purchase materials. Gabriel still struggled to believe that the entire project had a purely mercenary purpose. Why else would Roy be building a road through the center of town? As they reached the top of a hill outside the city, Roy took in the view and spoke to his servant. He told Gabriel that sooner or later, nothing would be left on this mountain. Gabriel was confused, so Roy explained that producing the heating system required large amounts of wood. In time, only stumps would remain. Puzzled, Gabriel asked why they would continue if it meant destroying all the trees. Roy replied that he had decided to stop constructing the Appian Way and would instead begin mining coal from a nearby cave. He was already planning to sell it at a high price once news of his heating system spread, knowing people would find the offer irresistible. For their own townspeople, he would offer a small discount. Gabriel thought the plan was unfair, even cruel. Could Roy truly be that calculating? Yet, if they refused, the estate's debts could not be repaid. Gabriel understood this, but still believed Frona's views were wrong. He warned his master, noting that the Baron knew nothing of these plans and would not let them go unchallenged. In the past, others had tried mining coal, but the unstable ground had caused repeated collapses. Roy, however, remained optimistic, confident that modern earthwork techniques could prevent such disasters. He spoke of the shield method, a movable, prefabricated metal structure that ensured safe mining operations and created permanent fortifications. Roy was eager to proceed, convinced that he and Gabriel had great things to accomplish. Although Gabriel had never seen this new technology, he was curious about what his ambitious master might achieve. The two decided to return home. The entrance to the old mineral cave was almost completely blocked by stone, yet it stretched tens of meters into the hollow. From the darkness emerged a strange creature, its long, thin, sensitive antennae twitching. In the shadows beyond, the red eyes of other creatures glimmered. They were giant ants. A whole army of them appeared, each with sharp, pointed jaws and large, glowing red eyes. They were all drawn to the scent of new prey from outside. Roy clapped his hands together in concentration, and began forming a magic symbol with his fingers. He gathered energy and transformed it into a massive beam of light, launching it into the sky. As he did so, he imagined living in the finest apartment in one of Seoul's wealthiest neighborhoods. The magical stream soared high above the clouds, disappearing beyond the horizon, leaving behind only a faint star. In his mind, he was standing before the grandest house in Seoul's richest district. He wished it were real, but unfortunately, Roy didn't possess that kind of incredible power. In reality, Frenner was at his desk, sketching blueprints for a plan to create an underground exit using his own magic. He had invested a great deal of time in this work, though he soon received a message that reminded him he only possessed a single skill: intermediate design. He wished for 100 hardy workers to assist him without cost, though he still appreciated his blueprint drawing ability. Thanks to his involvement in the incident with Newman, he had earned 639 RP and left a strong impression on the Baron, Baroness Gabriel, and others. Roy invested these points into upgrading his skills, allowing him to acquire new ones. He soon returned to the cave to determine where to dig. Among his new abilities was mid-level underground scanning, which let him see a distance of 5 meters beneath the surface. It was enough to guide him in finding the correct path, but one major problem remained: digging a passage quickly. Ordinary people would tire too easily performing such grueling work. Pak was no help, having fallen ill during the road's construction. Even if he had recovered, his massive size made it far too risky to involve him. Left with no other choice, Roy used the messenger to summon a random mystical creature. He had enough points to do so, and soon a glowing magic portal appeared before him. From its light emerged a small head topped with a bow. Moments later, a tiny pink creature with a bell on its tail tumbled onto the road. She quickly stood, gazing at her new master with bright eyes, letting out cheerful bell-like sounds. Roy was stunned that such a cute being could be described as a ruthless machine. Despite her innocent appearance, he suspected she carried poison in her teeth. After all, the podon had also seemed harmless at first. Still, he believed this new companion could prove valuable. Roy asked if she could grow in size using a red sunflower seed. She confirmed this and revealed she also had her own unique superpower. When he asked her to demonstrate, she responded with a smile. Weeks later, the giant bellflower creature devoured the earth as it tunneled deeper, its body shielded within the cave. In addition to its ability to resize, it had acquired earth excavation and soil cultivation, both at the first level. Standing behind the massive creature, Roy gave orders. Xavier prepared himself while Gabriel, already drenched in sweat, gripped his sword tightly. When the bellflower unleashed scorching metal projectiles, Xavier swiftly sliced through them with his skill, shaping identical tubes from the fragments. Using tools and fire, the blacksmith forged the tubes into sturdy supports. But then came the harsh reality. Gabriel struggled to understand why someone like him was forced to handle the secretions of a colossal snake. Roy, despite also dripping with sweat, led every step of the process with confidence. Together with Gabriel and the serpent, the team pressed deeper into the rock. Yet, as the tunnel stretched further, the lack of oxygen began to take its toll. Roy's head spun as dizziness set in. If they hadn't installed a pipe to bring in oxygen, everyone would have passed out long ago. Gabriel remarked that the owner, like the other workers, needed rest. Roy refused, insisting he had to oversee the work process, as a proper supervisor should. In Korea, many managers only talk, and sometimes Roy encountered bosses who had never even visited their own work sites. At that moment, the young frontline worker promised himself he would never be like that. He would personally monitor every process. Using his internal scanner, Roy detected something within the rock. It was the coal they had been searching for. He proudly announced to the workers that they had almost reached their goal, and only a little more effort was needed. One man thanked the snake for the belt, explaining that with its help, they had finished the job 10 times faster. The owner then declared that once they reached the coal seam, they would dismantle the shield to expand the space. Since it was a dangerous area, everyone had to remain extremely cautious. Suddenly, a strange knocking sound echoed from the ground behind them, drawing the attention of the robot. Mr. Frona was puzzled, as the city's ground was solid and should not collapse. He began scanning underground to investigate the noise. Moments later, a hole appeared where none had been before, and it grew larger before their eyes. Suddenly, a massive mutant ant emerged, terrifying everyone. Before Roy could react, the creature cornered him. Gabriel, always on guard, wasted no time. He drew his sword and sliced off the ant's giant pincers. Snapping back to his senses, the young frontman grabbed a shovel and rushed to help his servant. Fueled by rage and determination, he struck the monstrous creature until it was defeated. Though much larger than the men, the mutant was slain. Roy was baffled by its appearance, as such creatures had never been mentioned in the novel. But there was no time to relax. This was only one mutant ant, and an entire swarm was approaching from the crack. Their glowing red eyes lit up the darkness as they advanced. Roy immediately ordered everyone to evacuate the cave and head outside. Xavier courageously confronted the creatures, cutting them down one by one. Roy could not tell how many remained. Hundreds, perhaps thousands. If they reached the surface, the entire city would be doomed. Gabriel was weakening from the lack of oxygen, and their enemies could not be destroyed without explosives. Even if the cave collapsed, there was still a chance the ants would reach the surface. Roy froze, unsure of what to do, until Gabriel slapped him, forcing him to focus. Gathering his thoughts, Roy realized he had little time left. Gabriel could not hold them off much longer. Concentrating intensely, Roy pieced together every factor until an idea struck him like lightning. He seized a torch and turned to Xavier, declaring that they would attack and push forward. It sounded reckless to Gabriel, but he admitted it might work. Xavier fought furiously, slaying dozens of ants with his sword, while the men charged forward with desperate determination. By evening, a worker rushed to the frontiersman estate to deliver grim news to Baron Arrows. Shocked and alarmed by the ants' appearance, Arrows learned that all the workers had been evacuated safely except for Xavier and the swarm, who remained trapped in the tunnel. Furious, the Baron prepared to seal the mine entrance, but the swarm's father donned his armor and hurried with the worker to aid his son. Meanwhile, Gabriel continued battling the ants inside the cave. He could not understand why they kept attacking, as their numbers only grew. Roy cut him off sharply, saying he was too busy to explain. The only small relief was that, for now, the ants remained in their holes. Even though the situation was terrible, Xavier was almost on the verge of not caring about the heat or the lack of air. Despite the swarm of ants, he used his underground scanner to quickly get to the bottom of the problem. There had to be methane somewhere in this dungeon. After all, Cooled was a place where methanogens thrived, and layers of methane gas were scattered throughout the mineral veins. If he could find it, he would immediately blow up the ants. The man carefully inspected every corner of the cave, and soon enough, he found layers of methane gas. Roy quickly drove his shovel into the ground and asked Gabriel to hold the ants back while he dug. Using his speed and skill, Roy pushed himself to reach the methane layer as fast as possible. Suddenly, a Needon crept up on him unnoticed, but Xavier reacted instantly, removing the pest from their path. Roy continued digging tirelessly while Gabriel fought off the fierce creatures. Then, a deafening sound echoed through the cave. Startled, the men instinctively covered their ears and eyes. From the depths of the tunnel emerged a massive pink ant 10 times larger than the others. The men instantly realized it was the queen. One of her jaws alone was taller than Xavier. Roy hoped that the servant could somehow overpower her, but Gabriel knew his own limits and admitted it was beyond him. Yet they had no choice. The queen lunged at Xavier. He activated his heart of mana to brace for defense, while Gabriel searched for her weaknesses. For her, their blows were insignificant, but Xavier pushed himself to hurt her any way he could. His attacks only enraged the queen further. Still, as long as Xavier held her off, Roy could keep digging without interruption. Amid the battle, a strange hissing rose from beneath the swarm. Royd grabbed a torch and ordered Xavier to retreat with him toward the exit. The furious queen chased after them. The men reached the narrow entrance they had used before and leapt through. Royd turned back for a brief moment, spotted the queen, and hurled his torch at her. The burning flame struck her head, bounced to the ground, and frightened the other ants, who scattered deeper into the tunnel. The enraged queen pressed forward to finish them. But at that moment, methane gas leaked through a crack in the tunnel and ignited from the torch's flame. A massive explosion ripped through the cave, engulfing the queen at its center. Blown several meters away, Xavier shielded his master's body from the blast. The ants could only watch in horror as their queen burned in a fiery vortex that soon consumed them as well. Amid the chaos, a falling stone struck Xavier's head, but he continued to protect young Frona. At the mine's entrance, the workers, along with Byron and Arrows, heard the thunderous echo of the explosion. Overcome with emotion, the father wanted to rush in after his son, but Bayern stopped him at the last moment, warning of the danger. Inside, the men lay amid a pile of stones and smoke. Royd regained consciousness, his ears ringing painfully from the blast. Struggling to his feet, he spotted the queen's lifeless head and realized his plan had succeeded. Looking at Xavier, he saw the servant had shielded him and apologized for the scratches Xavier had suffered in the explosion. But then he looked up and noticed the cave exit was completely blocked by fallen rocks. Things had turned grim. Suddenly, dizziness washed over him. A warning message appeared, alerting him that his body lacked oxygen. He already knew. That was why he had to find a way outside fast. Using his scanner, Royd estimated the rubble to be about 5 meters thick. The oxygen level was dropping dangerously low, but young Frona had no choice. He had to dig for Xavier. Inside the bell, Gabriel regained consciousness and saw his master. His vision blurred, and the only thing he could hear was his master saying they had to escape together. Royd declared that he would not leave them behind. At that moment, Gabriel lost consciousness again and collapsed. The messenger expressed admiration for the young frontier's determination to stay with Xavier. Gabriel's opinion of him improved by 6 points, bringing Royd's total to 157 points. He was breathing heavily, gasping for the last gulps of oxygen. With nothing left to lose, he pulled himself together and turned to the messenger, activating the search for knowledge that could help him develop new skills. The messenger began processing data, scanning him, and searching for the knowledge he needed. It found the skills mana absorption, mana processing, and mana increase. By combining them, Royd could master the Azran core technique. This was exactly what he needed. The young frontier had been training relentlessly since his duel with Newman, confident in his ability to keep improving. Without hesitation, he agreed to receive the technique, spending 15 RP. In an instant, Royd obtained the Azran core technique at the 5th level, single ring. A small blue spark appeared in the darkness, forming a ring that he felt deep inside. Although he had no mana in his heart, he could sense the presence of the mana rings within. His mana expanded by 120%. Normally, such results wouldn't appear immediately, even with intense training. But with his large reserve of RP, he could enhance his skill level instantly. Royd decided to push forward and bet everything. His Azran core technique quickly advanced to level 6, expanding his mana by 125%. Each upgrade, however, cost an additional 5 points. Despite the rising cost, he continued leveling the technique until it reached level 10. Though he considered saving points for the future, he had little choice. His mana ring, once revolving around his heart, split into 2 first-level rings, expanding his mana by 200%. Advancing further required 100 RP, but he had only 7 left. Curious about his current condition, Royd asked the messenger for details. It informed him that he now had 2 available skills, a 10-minute stamina stretch that prevented fatigue, and an energy burst that tripled his mana for 20 seconds. Both could only be used once per day. Accepting this, Royd prepared for a rapid dig. Activating the stalker's skill to suppress fatigue, he began digging toward the exit with renewed determination. His oxygen level was at its lowest point. Desperately, he prayed for daylight to break through the rubble. Using his scanner, he pressed forward despite the suffocating air. Suddenly, he noticed a tiny crack, the very gap he had been searching for. It was the way out. Earth flew faster than ever from beneath his shovel. Behind him, Gabriel and Belle still lay unconscious. Gritting his teeth, Royd continued without pause, even as oxygen dwindled to his final breaths. Only 3 meters separated him from freedom. Exhausted, he collapsed to his knees, his shovel falling from his hands as the skill faded. On the verge of despair, he decided to unleash his energy release skill. Rising to his feet, he seized the shovel once more. Every second was precious. He dug furiously, knowing the skill lasted only 20 seconds. Just 30 centimeters of earth separated him from the rescue hole. Meanwhile, there was no oxygen left. Having dug through such a large stretch of earth, Royd no longer had the strength or air to continue. He collapsed powerlessly on the ground, only 30 centimeters away from the exit, so close, yet so far. As despair set in, Royd thought about how quickly it could all end. After all, as the son of an influential man living in a remote area, he had only dreamed of a quiet and normal life. It felt as if his story had come to a close. But suddenly, he heard a strange and familiar sound. With the last of his strength, Royd lifted himself onto his elbows to see where it came from. At that moment, a giant hamster named Pong Long, familiar to him, emerged from the ground. The sight filled Royd with joy, bringing a smile to his face. Fresh air flowed into the tunnel, and Royd immediately smelled freedom. Encouraged, he forced himself back onto his feet, telling himself that the peaceful life of a baron's son was still waiting for him. Night had already fallen, and twilight blanketed the city. Inside the cave, a torch burned brightly as Arcus, Byron, and the townspeople pressed through the tunnel in search of the missing men. Though warned by the darkness, the Baron was determined to go all the way. Suddenly, he stopped when he noticed a figure moving in the depths of the tunnel. A few meters ahead, the silhouette of a man carrying something on his back was coming toward them. It was Royd, rescuing his humble servant. In that critical moment, the use of his special skills allowed Royd to surpass human limits. Combined with Azin's new core technique, this had an immense impact on him. As a result, a new third-level skill power mode became available, enabling him to operate the core technique even under severe exhaustion. Frontera's father recognized his son instantly and ran toward him, shouting his name. Confused and drained, the young warrior carried Gabriel and the bell on his back, barely registering his father's presence. When the man reached him, Royd finally collapsed into his arms along with the servant. By deep night, the ordeal had taken a toll on everyone. But at dawn, the city was already buzzing with gossip and speculation about the events. In the streets, 2 men argued about the young swarm master, how they viewed him before and how they saw him now. One claimed that his nephew had been at the very center of the battle and saw it all with his own eyes. He explained how, when the giant ants attacked, the young baron thought first of saving the workers rather than himself. The entire town seemed to be discussing Royd and Xavier's bravery. Though opinions varied, everyone agreed that this swarm was unlike any they had faced before. Meanwhile, the subject of all this talk was lying in bed under Gabriel's careful watch. The young frontline soldier needed time to recover. After a long rest, he finally opened his eyes. Xavier, who had waited anxiously, was relieved to see his master conscious again. Soon, Royd received a message. The people of Frontera's estate and the townsfolk were deeply impressed by his heroic actions. Whether awake or half-conscious, he barely understood the words, but the messenger informed him that he would be rewarded with extra RP points for his achievements. His scoreboard updated to show 507 points. Realization washed over him. He had become a hero. The added reward of 500 rupiah filled him with pride and joy, renewing his energy. The next morning, the settlement was alive with activity. Workers reinforced the tunnel walls and resumed their daily duties. Suddenly, a long-awaited visitor caught their attention. Royd, along with Fra and Gabriel, returned from the mine. The workers stopped to pay their respects, praising him for his efforts. They looked at their savior with admiration, seeing him as unlike other nobles, a true embodiment of nobility. Their praise and kind words made Royd feel ashamed, for 2 weeks had already passed since the victory over the ants. The mines were once again in full swing, and everything seemed to be going well. Yet, amid the progress, Royd reminded himself that safety must always come first. He wanted to avoid even the smallest risk of danger. On this day, their primary task was to search for ant tracks. Gabriel approached, intending to ask him something, but Royd urged him to be quick. To conserve oxygen, the man asked the swarm why he constantly put himself in danger. After all, he could simply order others to do it for him. He believed that the owner couldn't possibly be concerned only with the comfort and safety of ordinary workers. As the future heir to the estate, he was expected to prioritize his own well-being above all else. In response, the young frontier called the servant a fool. His true duty, he explained, was to take full responsibility for every possible risk. Gabriel looked at his young master in embarrassment. Roy clarified his position, saying that even if he spent large amounts of money, no one would dare question him. The savior wasn't sure if this was good or bad for him. Just then, the messenger informed the owner that Gabriel's level of sympathy was about to increase, but he suddenly changed his mind. The men eventually reached a blank stone wall. Gabriel suggested searching elsewhere, but the young frontline soldier wasn't so quick to dismiss it. He suspected there was empty space within the wall, perhaps where the queen had laid her eggs, from which new offspring could emerge. To test this theory, he began digging. What he uncovered shocked him. Inside the wall was a dense chamber containing a green humanoid creature with fangs, suspended above the ground by its hands, bound tightly in webs. Among the other victims of the insect mutants were animals wrapped in the same strong threads, mostly horses and pigs. Gabriel found the green creature dangerous and wanted to deal with it immediately, though his decision wasn't well thought out. He was curious to know what it truly was. Gabriel explained that it was simply an orc. The owner suspected it might be anonymous, but he recalled that ants often preserve their prey by paralyzing them rather than killing them outright. This realization excited Roy, who couldn't hide his smile at the incredible discovery. That same day, they brought the green orc back to the frontier estate. His name was Garash. The orc declared that Roy was his savior, someone he would never forget. Roy asked why Garash always ended his sentences with kick. Perhaps it was a quirk to match his character more harmoniously, though Garash himself didn't understand the question. Garash turned out to be the son of the tribal leader of the Steel Sand clan. Thanks to the doctor's care, he quickly regained consciousness. Once again, he stressed that he would never forget Roy's kindness and promised to reward him with whatever he desired. Encouraged by this, Roy asked Garash for 120 orcs to work in the mines. However, Garash refused. Roy was confused and saddened by the rejection and asked why. To Garash, it seemed suspicious that the swarm clicked his tongue, as if Roy were a bad person. But the young frontier explained it was nothing more than a habit, just like Garash's own tendency to add kick at the end of his words. Garash then clarified the true reason for his refusal. Orcs were warriors, bound only to obey their commander's orders. Since Roy was not a warrior, he could not command them. Garash also explained that, upon reaching adulthood, every orc was required to venture into the wild and return with the head of a giant ant. Unfortunately, he had failed this rite of passage. When he entered the ant hive, he was instantly paralyzed. Hearing this, Roy formed a new plan, licking his lips at the thought. Outwardly, he pretended to accept Garash's decision and congratulated him on coming of age with a polite round of applause. But Garash revealed that he had never been able to bring back a giant ant's head, as he was immobilized inside the hive. At first, Roy didn't understand. After all, Goose had killed a giant ant alongside him, and its head now hung proudly on the wall of Roy's room as a trophy. But Garash couldn't remember ever managing to slay such a creature. The frontier explained that Garash had no memory of it because he had been unconscious at the time. Roy told his new companion about the incredible scene he had witnessed the moment he entered the hive and saw the queen trembling in fear, screaming in disbelief that she had been defeated by one so young. Harash wondered how the mutant ants could understand human speech, but Roy explained that it was true, as they had made great progress in this skill recently. The man emphasized that it was thanks to Harash that it had become much easier for him to locate their hive. Gabriel, however, couldn't understand why the owner was so confidently lying to his new friend about his incredible feats. In truth, the man only wanted to support the orc, who was embarrassed by his failure, and give him hope. Roy placed his hands on the orc's shoulders in a friendly manner, finishing his speech in an atmosphere of trust. In the end, the young frontline soldier once again confirmed that they had overcome the giant ant together, declaring that Harash was an unsurpassed warrior, just like Roy himself. The orc was sincerely ashamed and embarrassed after receiving such heartfelt words in his direction. On this positive note, the man decided to bring up the subject of helping 120 orcs return to work. This time, Gash expressed his full and unquestioning agreement. Exactly 1 week later, the men set out for the sandy valley beyond the green forest, on the outskirts of the city. Before long, the three of them reached the village of the Steel Sand Orcs. Their wigwams were fascinating, built from wood and bones, decorated with their national symbol, the coat of arms. It seemed that the long journey in search of labor was finally over. However, the tribal leader and Barrow's father, Akush, regretfully informed Roy that they would not be able to fulfill his request. Roy was shocked that the orcs would refuse him, but he did not lose hope and politely asked the chief for the reason behind his decision. Akush explained that his people were not strong enough to take on such a task. To remain strong, they needed to eat meat, and if they didn't hunt, their muscles would weaken. The loss of strength, he said, would lead to the decline of the Steel Sand tribe. Therefore, they could not afford to reduce the number of warriors who went hunting. Roy interrupted the explanation to ask if they truly needed to hunt every day. The chief confirmed that they did, otherwise, their muscles would weaken quickly. Gabriel found it absurd that the orcs were so obsessed with their own muscles, but he explained to the owner that for these creatures, protein and strength were the very meaning of life. He suggested that perhaps it was best to abandon the idea altogether. Still, Roy considered the orcs' needs and thought of a compromise. He proposed to the leader that if the meat could be preserved for several days, they would not need to hunt daily, which would free workers for his mine. Akush agreed, motivated by his desire to repay the men who had returned his son to him. Roy then enthusiastically explained that they could indeed keep the meat fresh for longer. But before continuing, he recalled the moment when they had first arrived in the orc village. Barrows had cried out for his father's name. Akush, with tears in his eyes, could hardly believe he was seeing his son again. Barrows ran as fast as he could to meet his father, who in turn rushed to embrace him. Humans and orcs alike watched this moving reunion as father and son collided in a powerful embrace, clinging to each other with overwhelming emotion. The ground itself shook with the force of their reunion. Roth thought to himself that if he had stood between them, he would have been crushed to dust in an instant. At the same time, he realized that if he could recruit 120 such brave craftsmen, their production would increase 1,000-fold. There was yet another moment that deserved attention. Harash proudly presented his father with the head of the mutant ant queen. Akush, filled with pride, announced to his people that a celebration would be held in his son's honor. Later, Roy had the chance to watch the orcs train. To his astonishment, they used golden items and jewelry as workout equipment. Golden columns were lifted like ordinary dumbbells in their gym. The young frontline soldier could not comprehend what he was seeing. It seemed as though the orcs were pulling these treasures out of thin air, for such precious items were worth 10 times more than any sports equipment. Impressed, the Great One signed a construction contract with the leader of the tribe. In this way, they secured both the labor they needed and access to the orcs' hidden wealth. The men intended to build a stone-cold storage facility for preserving meat, and in return, they would receive various precious items. However, Gabriel quickly realized that they would need special tools to work with the stone. The servant had never heard of such a vault before, so he decided to ask his master about it. Ruth explained to Xavier that royal wizards could keep food fresh using the cooling power of ice magic. A cold store served the same purpose, but without the use of magic. Gabriel was astonished by his master's knowledge, though Xavier made no effort to explain how he knew such things. First, they needed granite to build the storage, since it was strong enough to withstand the task. Roy pointed to a granite rock to make his words clear. Something told Gabriel that acquiring the stone would not be easy, and Roy confirmed his suspicion. Although they had no explosives with them, they did have a substitute. The young front man turned to Gabriel and pointed at him. After all, Xavier already had a man capable of producing explosions. Xavier realized that his master wanted him to handle the situation. This moment marked one of the key turning points in the novel The Steel Knight. The story described the legendary city of Manhwa, perched atop a cliff and surrounded by a pink glow. The city was trapped within a magical barrier, where thousands of refugees were imprisoned. It was Xavier's duty to save them. By this time, Gabriel had nearly become a sword master, his mana heart already possessing the 4th mana ring. For a time, he stood powerless, watching as the mana of the captives was drained away. Determined to save them, even at the cost of his own life, he unknowingly created a new skill of propulsion. His secret lay in protecting his main mana heart with one ring, while channeling the power of the other 3 into a single devastating blow. The combined force flowed from his mana heart into his hand, and then into his sword, resulting in a massive explosion. The blast wave launched Xavier into the air before he crashed back down to the ground. From that moment on, this explosion became a signature technique, one that, alongside Azram's mind technique, would define the legend of the Steel Knight. Roy asked if such a technique could be used again. Gabriel, however, demanded to know how his master had learned about it. Roy insisted this was the first time he had even thought of the idea, and though his words seemed honest, Xavier saw deception in his eyes. Still, the embarrassed Roy quickly urged Gabriel to try. Despite his doubts, Gabriel believed his master would find a way to bend events to his will. The young front man then reminded Gabriel to always wish others well, and promised that if Xavier succeeded in applying the theory, it would be a great advantage for the Baron's son. Gabriel stepped toward the granite rock and prepared to unleash the propulsion technique. He shielded his mana heart with one ring, then forcefully released the other 3. With a decisive strike of his sword, he channeled the full force of the rings into the stone. A brilliant light burst from the point of impact. For a moment, Roy thought Gabriel had succeeded on his very first attempt. From the cloud of dust, Xavier's silhouette emerged. His clothes were torn, his expression grim. He demanded to know if his master had planned this outcome. Roy denied it, apologizing for what had happened. But Xavier was satisfied this time. At least, the master's plan had worked. Now, it was the young Frida's turn. The messenger told the owner that Xavier was grateful for this lesson, and Gabriel's level of sympathy for him increased by 3 points. However, the overall level of sympathy for the host remained at -11. Gabriel also received 54 RPS for improving his relationship with a key character, bringing his total to 561. Gabriel reflected that his master knew his skill and should use it to protect the Baron, yet now it was being applied to construction. Roy interpreted these words as gratitude from his servant, though that was not the case. From that point onward, the construction progressed at a much faster pace. The granite Xavier split and shaped was transported to the site by a hamster named Potom. The orcs, eager to keep people from straining themselves, took on the heavy physical work without being asked. Addicted to training, they treated the lifting and lowering of massive granite blocks as part of their usual exercise. Roy estimated that at this pace, construction would finish 5 times faster. For the next stage, however, they still needed ice and insulation. Roy asked Xavier how long it had been since he had sent workers to collect the insulation material. Xavier replied it had been exactly 3 weeks. They should have returned by now. Gabriel suggested the soldiers might be lazy, or perhaps something else had delayed them. Roy suspected something more serious may have happened on their way back. Concerned, Roy stood to set out and find his men, but Gabriel stopped him. Xavier then offered to search for the soldiers himself, believing it was too risky for the owner to go personally since they didn't know what had happened. Roy reminded him that they had already discussed this. He was responsible for organizing the construction and, therefore, for the safety of his workers. Gabriel could only sigh and agree with his master. The 2 men set out on the road together, passing through sandy, rocky terrain where no plants or animals lived. Suddenly, Roy noticed a glove lying in the sand, one he had recently ordered for his men to use when handling insulation. While he examined it, Gabriel pointed out something else, a narrow crevice radiating a strange aura. Roy did not understand what was unusual, but Gabriel explained that the mana here flowed in a distorted, unnatural way, leaving everything blurred and unclear. Roy recalled encountering something like this before while reading a novel about the Knight of Steel. Realizing the connection, his expression hardened, and he ordered Xavier to leave the area with him immediately. Gabriel was confused by his master's urgency, but the swarm anxiously told Xavier that their soldiers were most likely no longer alive. The servant's words left Gabriel both shocked and afraid.